There's a lot of debate goes on around comparing different regimes and different sets of outcomes between different countries. And there's a danger when you do that of cherry picking. So you can take one country, and Sweden is often held up as that country, which has, by European standards, fairly low levels of drug use, and they have, by European standards or by global standards, fairly strict prohibitionist approach. They don't make a distinction between soft and hard drugs. I don't particularly like those terms, but all drugs are basically dealt with the same. They are illegal. They're actually very restrictive about legal drugs as well. In fact, alcohol is heavily taxed. It's controlled by through government outlets. Effectively have a state monopoly on alcohol supply as well as taxation and pricing. So they have historically quite a kind of prohibitionist, abstemious culture. And in fact, they actually use, it's interesting that that goes across the medical world as well. They use a lot less prescription drugs than a lot of other European countries as well. The fact that they have a prohibitionist oriented culture and a very clear policy aim of creating a drug-free society, and they have relatively low levels of drugs, is often held up by people as, well, look, this is what everyone else should be doing. But it's also, I think you need to acknowledge with somewhere like Sweden, they also have very low levels of inequality. They have a very kind of historically kind of left-leaning society with high levels of taxation on rich people. They have very low levels of poverty and social deprivation. They have an amazingly well-funded welfare state. So a lot of the what I would see is the drivers of the underlying social drivers of problematic drug use are much lower in a country like Sweden that has this very kind of welfare state-oriented society. And it may well be, and I think there's a reasonable case to make, that the low levels of inequality and the generally higher levels of social and personal well-being in Sweden may be, and their sort of historical culture in terms of drug use more broadly, may be more significant drivers of their historically low levels of drug use than their drug policy. I think probably the role of drug policy in terms of traditional drug policy, treatment, education and enforcement has probably been dramatically overstated by governments everywhere. And in fact, it has fairly marginal levels of impact on overall levels of use. It's interesting comparing somewhere like Sweden to Holland, the Netherlands, which is widely perceived to be terribly liberal. It's actually quite a conservative country, and they have quite strict enforcement on the supply side. But they have more or less decriminalised personal possession. So if you're caught with drugs, you're generally not prosecuted, or you don't tend to go through sort of you're not generally processed through the criminal justice system. And they famously have their tolerated cannabis coffee shops. And it is striking that cannabis use in Holland is not significantly higher, in some cases lower, than some of their neighbours that don't have coffee shops and don't have decriminalised use and outlets. So it's very easy to cherry pick. And if you look at the European countries or world countries more broadly, there's no clear correlation between intensity of enforcement or punitiveness of enforcement and levels of use or misuse. There is no link. So you have countries like the UK, which by European standards are quite punitive, and we have the highest level of use in Europe, or nearly the highest levels of use in Europe. And you have countries like the US, which is extremely punitive. They have 500,000 or 600,000 drug offenders or drug-related offenders in prison. And they have one of the highest levels of drug use overall in the whole of the Western world. So, but interestingly, the UK and US, if you look at the kind of UNICEF well-being charts, are regularly at the top. And you do actually, if you look at levels of well-being or levels of inequality within countries, and you plot that against levels of drug use, there does seem to be more of a correlation. So again, I would say it's the underlying social conditions which are the key drivers of drug use, not drug policy, which is the impact of which has probably been dramatically overstated.